You know, I look at this amendment, and very much like my colleague Pat Fallon from Texas, I think to myself, what is it exactly that we're asking for here? A report. A report to actually understand what has DEI actually done for our armed forces. And when I look at this, I identify a couple of things, having served in the military for a long time, but also serving in government as a whole, to where I spent 7 years of my life in Iraq, 3 years of my life in Afghanistan, Kosovo, Pakistan, northern Somalia, was blown up twice in '06. I can tell you that not a single person that I served with, whether it was Michael Johnson, who is from Bushwick and who is a black male, or whether it was our friend, Alfredo Perez from Puerto Rico, or whether it was others who was from Cambodia who lived out in San Francisco, or otherwise, did we care what we looked like? Nor did our enemies. Those bullets, those bombs, none of them cared what color you were, what race you identify with, and that's the difference here. It's a big difference when we talk about inclusion versus division, equity versus equality, identity as opposed to meritocracy. We are about strengthening our forces. And if you walk out to Arlington Cemetery right now, where I have people that I served with buried, and you don't know the person who's actually in that grave, and all you see is a name, you couldn't tell me the color of skin of that individual who has served our armed forces and died for our armed forces. As far as I'm concerned, I look at the numbers. I look at our recruitment, and very much what General Bergman has said through his 40-plus years, it is about recruitment, retention, and readiness. We don't need to focus on diversity, equity, inclusion. It needs to be increased lethality, readiness, and being properly prepared. Because our adversaries are spending 0 hours when it comes to China and Russia thinking about these things. And all we're asking for is a report to understand how this has helped. Because I can tell you that if you look at some of the DEI resources, here's one of the websites that includes reading that says, when white bodies say, tell me what to do, it states, if you have a white body and you've just begun to recognize how white body supremacy affects the world and harms you, here are some ways to sink your toes into somatic abolitionism. Does that sow inclusion or division? And I think that when we look at our numbers at 25,000 in deficit and 8,600 if you add into those who were purged out of the COVID, you're talking about 3 Army divisions that were short in our recruitment efforts. That tells me that DEI is not only not working, but it's actually impacting and negatively to our recruitment and retention capabilities. So I think a report to understand this should be welcomed, as well as for how money is being spent, which is our job as stewards of taxpayers' funding. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I plan on voting no on this amendment. I had not planned on speaking until I heard that racism is diminishing in America. If we ever needed a reason, an example as to why we need to teach critical race theory and diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's statements like this. If we fail to learn from the mistakes of our past, and this country has made mistakes, whether it was strategic, military, human rights, civil rights, then we are doomed to repeat it. And I'm speaking as the representative of constituents whose families suffered at the hands of the Chinese Exclusion Act, as the great-granddaughter of someone who was interned in the Japanese internment camps while his son, my grandfather, fought for a country that thought his family was aliens, essentially, fought in the military intelligence service all the while to prove his loyalty to this country. We have definitely made mistakes as a country. And as I listen to the kinds of rhetoric I hear here and the amendments that I see today that we will be voting on, I am terrified for my children, and more so, I am saddened for our country, that it looks very clearly we have not made any progress in learning from the mistakes of our past. In fact, we are doomed to repeat it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Chairman, I have a question, a yes or no answer for the maker of the motion. So since this is a report on the number of hours spent in training and the total cost, if this motion is supported, does that mean you're going to withdraw the other amendments that are very divisive, dealing with diversity, equity, and inclusion? Yes or no?
No.
So it's your intent to use this hearing today to not talk about national security, to not talk about preparedness, but to spend an inordinate amount of time talking about a wedge issue that your side is choosing to use in this hearing rather than housing, health care, mental health services, child care, equipping our military men and women and our service members with the tools and resources. That's your intent for the rest of this portion of the hearing today?
Will the gentleman yield?
No, I won't. I'm asking a question. Yes
Well,
or
right, you have to yield to me so that I can
Yes
answer.
or no? Is that your intent?
Well, I reject the premise of your question, which
Of course
is
you
these
do.
things are not tied to national
Reclaiming my
security.
time.
I think you just heard
Reclaiming
Mr.
my
Banks
time.
explain how they were.
I just asked you a yes or no question.
One person at a time speaking. The gentleman, Mr. Horsford, controls the time.
So, Mr. Chairman, I will oppose the motion because it's clear the intent is not to simply get a report, as you indicated it was. It's to use this hearing to dominate the time on wedge issues that are about dividing our nation. You want to talk about race? You want to talk about equity and inclusion? We've had many hearings about this. And at a time when our military service members and their families are putting their very lives in danger, for you to use this time to divide the nation and divide our military is inappropriate. So I'm going to vote no on your motion, and I'll debate your other amendments as they come up, because now I know what your full intent is for the rest of today's hearing. With that, I yield my time to the chair.